Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Moti, for inviting me to talk about sex for a while and also a little bit of food today. So indeed, as Daphna so vividly demonstrated just now, during the 1980s, a new middle class was formed in Israel as part of an economic privatization and globalization. The cultural elite of this new class fraction was busy creating its own distinctive lifestyle through many cultural channels. This aspirational lifestyle was based on self-expression and self-improvement. Its pillars were consumerism, art, and, as I will show, sex. Today I ask, how did sex become a cultural resource to be incorporated into this new middle-class lifestyle? What I'm presenting today's story is part of an ongoing research on class, sex, and sexuality in a globalized Israel. Arguably, while both sex and class have been key issues in modern sociology, relatively little attention has been paid to the sex-class relationship. Consequently, the role of sexual meanings and practices in contemporary class-making processes has to date not been sufficiently explored. We simply don't know enough on how sex is enmeshed in class cultures. In this theoretical context, I examined some of the ways in which sex came to represent cultural connoisseurship in Israel. I do so by analyzing representations of sex in the first lifestyle magazine in Israel entitled Monitin, which literally means reputation. Scholars of Israeli culture demonstrate that the shared meaning of sex and sexuality is associated with a Zionist Puritanism, as well as a nationalization of sex and love, and a sexual orientalization of social others, such as Mizrahim, Oriental Jews, and Arabs. However, if we take media representations of sex as our case study, it seems that in the late 1970s, the carnal pleasures of sex appear as socially acceptable and even as desirable. Sexual experimentalism came to mark cosmopolitan identities, as well as cultural refinement and economic privilege. In order to better grasp this culturalization of sex, at that particular moment, I focus on media discourses of heterosexuality and the cultural codes of sex they invoked. I compare representations of sex in Monitin to those in another prominent Israeli magazine, the weekly Laisha, literally for the woman. Importantly, the two publications address different audiences in terms of class. Laisha, a classic women's magazine, has a middle and low middle class readership, whereas Monitin addressed this rising new middle class. Laisha has been following the footsteps of American and European women's magazine in training its readers to become smart domestic consumers and professional housewives, thereby reproducing traditional gender roles. More recently, the magazine has incorporated feminist tones and ideals. Unlike Laisha, Monitin wasn't a gender-specific lifestyle magazine. It was published from 1978 to 1993 and was never as popular as Laisha. Monitin was associated with the emerging professional, managerial, creative and business sector in Israeli society. The magazine was initiated by Rafi Shauli and a group of high-profile businessmen who were regulars at Shauli's fancy elite discotheque called Hamoadon, the club, located in Tel Aviv. Monitin was meant not only to brand the club per se, but also to provide a platform for this sector's desire for distinction. Indeed, Monitin didn't look and read like anything before. It aspired to establish a new journalistic style. Printed on chroma sheets, it beautifully showcased the photographic images this magazine is best known for. The first charismatic editor was Adam Baruch, who was recruited from the artistic field, where he was positioned as an avant-garde taste arbiter. His editorial board comprised of new bohemian writers, journalists, and photographers who were greatly inspired by American culture, its art, and journalism. Content-wise, Monitin valued equally the political, the economic, the artistic, and the leisurely. It contained a lot of sexual content as well. While Monitin was not the first to publish sexual content in the public sphere, unlike earlier erotic journals and pulp fiction, sex in Monitin represented all that was new, hip, and cool. For example, articles in Monitin depicted diverse sexual worlds, some socially marginal, such as a New York orgy club, an autoethnography of a turned-on Adam Baruch watching an erotic show on cable TV, a piece on aged prostitutes, or an interview with the editor of the Screw magazine. It also contained many erotic images. In fact, there is not even a single issue in the whole of my corpus which does not contain explicit erotic visuals. For example, one article depicts naked models posing in, and I quote, white, minimalist, furnished advertising agencies, end of quote, taken by a Berlin-based photographer. Another article presented photographer Helmut Newton's extremely racy works, and this exemplifies a common practice of the magazine in which readers are offered a crash course, we might say, in reading sexual images as art. Thus, Monitin rehabilitated pornography, rendered sex artistic, and contributed to the overall mainstreamization of sex. So how did Monitin guide its readers into this new sexual sensibility? In order to address this question, I compared the columns of two contributors, Dan Ben-Amotz for Monitin and Tzvi Lidsky for Laisha. These two columnists were renowned for their open and shameless writings on sex. It is therefore interesting to see how each of these writers discussed such matters, the sexual matter, given the different class origins of their readership. Both columnists offered their own perspective on the sexual revolution of the time. They did not belong to the more familiar magazine genre of sex advice, which promotes healthy sex. However, their depictions of sex are very different, and they present two almost opposing views. Lidsky was a criminal lawyer who became a local celebrity, writing racy stories on the city's dark alleys, which portrayed sexual pleasure as morally questionable. On the other hand, Ben-Amotz's autobiographical style pieces in Monitin were written in an instructive way, offering what can be considered as a sexually healthy lifestyle. An aging bohemian, yet, as Nitza Ben-Ari says, an expert in Sabra culture, Ben-Amotz was in a position to challenge the culture of sexual puritanism. Indeed, he wrote in a straightforward manner on the arts of sex and presented it as part of a broader lifestyle of free love, oral pleasures, sensuous gourmet cosmopolitan food, classical music, and intellectual conversations. This was achieved in a number of ways, which I will introduce right now. I will now describe the major ways sex was constructed in these two publications, Monitin and Laisha. So first, I've compared the poetic style of each publication. Ben-Amotz's voice is always autobiographical, and he also directly speaks to his readers. His presumably personal sexual adventures are crafted in a way that renders them truthful and real. This is in complete contrast to the way sex stories are told in Laisha, where Lidsky always tells an allegedly real-life story from a distance, based on his career as a lawyer who have seen it all. He is a professional, documenting other people's life in a way that encapsulates a hidden moral lesson he learned. Let me now look at what I call the food and sex trope. Thematically, the Monitin texts repeatedly equate food and sex. Ben-Amotz's columns share a similar logic. All begin with a direct address to a woman, as if the author speaks exclusively to her. It then moves to tell a story from the writer's past sexual experiences, where each sexual adventure revolves around one dish. The column ends up with a recipe for that dish, narrated in an impressionist and poetic way, clear enough, though, for readers to try at home if they will. That is, try either the sex, or the food, or both. Moreover, cooking and eating are sexualized themselves. Consider, for example, this citation in which Ben Amotz shares with his readers the aphrodisiac qualities of mango. I quote, "A heavy scent of mango filled her little shack. Her bed linen smelled of mango. Her breast smelled of mango. It also sweetly smelled of mango. To this day, when I take a bite in a ripe, juicy mango, I get an erection." End of quote. Also significant are the kinds of foods represented. For example, Mediterranean-style grilled aubergines, crab soup, eggs in sour cream with bread, and a glass of Riesling, and etc. These foodstuffs represent aesthetic preferences of a well-traveled man whose appetites developed by truly immersing himself in a non-Jewish food culture. Yet this is not a highbrow cultural connoisseurship of classic cuisine. Rather, the dishes can be easily prepared at home, carrying with them the taste and the sense of other places. This is a new kind of highbrow, more open and diverse. Note that in the late 1970s there were only a few gourmet restaurants in Israel, but the upper strata was certainly familiar with fine dining. Still, the idea that one can cook for oneself or company fine, not too complicated, and yet seemingly sophisticated food was less common, especially in the Israeli culture that appraised simple, no-fuss food. In this respect, Ben Amotz, as well as other foodists like him, made a huge impact on the leisure habits of the growing new middle-class strata. In comparison, Litsky's stories for Laisha registered sex totally differently. That is, not as highbrow and sensuous, but as lowbrow and corrupted. Whereas Ben Amotz seductively describes sexual acts, Litsky refrains from portraying them per se. In Litsky's world, sex simply facilitates a plot, and unlike Ben Amotz's story, sex is never the protagonist. For example, in one Laisha story, a man deceives his friend to believe that a woman he's dated was a transvestite in the wordings of those days. The transvestite figure is, of course, a rhetorical device representing non-normative sexuality. Many other stories also expose the dark or sleazy side of sex, cheating, stripping, or selling sex. In these stories, men by their nature lust women. Women on their side seduce men in order to gain other benefits. Again, compared with Ben Amotz's portrayal of sex as erotic, sensual, and beautiful, Litsky's texts construct sex as belonging to the underworld. So far, I have shown how sex in Monitin was deemed experiential and sensuous. But sex was also constructed as emblematic to cosmopolitan sensitivity. In most of Ben Amotz's stories, particularly in his food columns, sex is linked with an openness to the world outside the boundaries of an ideologically ascetic Israel. For example, the sexual adventures of Ben Amotz usually take place abroad, either in Paris, Port-au-Prince, Haiti, or an Italian cathedral, where he hooks up with local non-Jewish women. Comparatively, Litsky's stories are always located in Tel Aviv and convey a heightened sense of a local sex patriotism. For example, in one column, a group of successful men who came from New York to do business in Israel, I quote, sat in the bar of a luxurious hotel, sipping their drinks. "I would so much love to dance," said Timothy, his eyes sparkling beneath his eyeglasses, "especially with an Israeli woman. They are so great, real women, beautiful and passionate." "Yes, they say that Israeli chicks are the most beautiful in the world," said Joe, "a kind of a special race, the result of hybridizing races in an immigration country, the Jewish state. That's why they're so fine. Add to this their impulsive nature, their independence, their well-known sexual permissiveness, and you end up with the archetype of the sensuous, desired woman. End of quote. What we learn here, that the world-famous sexiness of Israeli women is not only good for men, but also for the nation. For what can be the ultimate justification for the Jewish state, if not Israeli eye candies? Moreover, Litsky's localism and local patriotism is achieved mainly by chronicling a suspicious world of passion